Our first speaker is Alex Loznak, who some of you may know now, has become quite famous throughout America. And he is one of 21 plaintiffs who have sued the US government for the, Alex will tell in more detail, but for the right and liberty to enjoy a stable climate. So first of all, we'll start with Alex. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you to everyone, the New York City Sierra Club, who made this event possible. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Excellent. So,
Stand.
you want me to stand?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to try and reference my notes while standing here. Yeah, so my name is Alex Loznak. I'm 20 years old. I'm a sophomore at Columbia University, and the reason I'm here tonight is I'm one of the 21 youth plaintiffs in a case called Juliana v. USA. And as you heard, we are suing the Trump administration for the right to a livable climate. Thank you. And it's by the way, it's a fascinating group of young people, very diverse and from every corner of the country and every walk of life, Hawaii, Alaska, New York, and then a lot of us are from my home state, in my opinion, the greatest state, Oregon. But we're supported by the nonprofit legal advocacy group Our Children's Trust. There's, I think, about a dozen attorneys working on our case now, pro bono, and from a number of different firms, as well as staff attorneys, law students, law professors all over the country, and a few undergraduates like me. And our case against the Trump administration follows similar cases that were successful, where citizens sued their government to the right to a stable climate all over the country at the state level, as well as internationally. Just recently, a girl in India sued the government of India. And two of the cases that have gone the furthest of this nature are in Washington State, domestically, and the Netherlands. And in both of those cases, they got similar to the outcome that we're looking for, which is where the court actually ordered the government to start reducing carbon emissions in order to protect fundamental rights of citizens. We are hoping that now the next step is going to be get the US federal government, the Trump administration, they may deny climate change, but we're going to force them to take action through this case. The fossil fuel industry, so we sued the federal government. The fossil fuel industry intervened in the case. So what that means, they see this as a threat. They see it as a credible threat to their business interest, which means they actually hired the best corporate lawyers that money can buy. Sidley Austin is the name of the group. And they're standing side by side with the government, and they're both arguing that my generation does not have the right to a stable climate and a healthy future. So initially the fossil fuel companies and the government tried to get the case dismissed. But recently, just a few days after the election, Judge Ann Aiken, who's a federal district judge in Oregon, she rejected the government and the industry motion to dismiss in a sweeping 50-page ruling. And I encourage you, if you get the chance to read it, some of the language and the argument is a beacon of moral clarity in a dark time, I believe. And some of the language and the argument is just soaring, just beautiful, beautiful language, even though the legal aspects to many of us, including myself, may seem kind of technical and difficult to not very accessible. I think it's actually very accessible, and the way it's written, it's just a gorgeous piece of writing. A few days after that ruling came out, the Washington Post ran a headline, and it said, "This climate lawsuit could change everything. No wonder the Trump administration doesn't want it going to trial." And I think that headline really encapsulates the paradigm-changing, game-changing nature of this lawsuit. So the title of tonight's event is, Urgently Seeking a New Cultural Ethic for the Planet. And in explaining the lawsuit, I'm going to offer a new cultural ethic for the planet that meets the urgency of the climate crisis through this lawsuit. Our case is really grounded in the moral and philosophical foundations of intergenerational equity. What kind of world are older generations going to leave to my generation? It also positions climate change fundamentally in the context of human rights and constitutional rights. We believe that climate rights are human rights and human rights are climate rights. We believe this can become a central rallying cry and an organizing principle for the climate change movement going forward. So before I get into all of that, I should say a little bit more about myself and a little bit perhaps about my co-plaintiffs. So as I said, I'm a sophomore at Columbia University, but I love New York City, but I grew up on my family's farm in Oregon. About as different as you could get actually within the United States. Sometimes I tell people I drove 30 miles every day to go to high school, and it was about 10 miles to the nearest convenience store. So it was a huge change for me coming to New York. But my great grandmother crossed the Oregon Trail almost 150 years ago to found the farm. And ever since then, my family has preserved the farm and passed it along to future generations. And I really believe that practice is analogous in many ways to some of the moral underpinnings of this case. Preserving the farm, passing it along. One of my favorite places there is a tree that's about 200 years old. It's remarkable to me to think about 200 years of human history that have passed during the lifetime of a single tree. And I think that tree really encapsulates that ethic of conservation and passing along resources to the next generation. And remember that if we have time, I might come back to the tree. So my co-plaintiffs, as I said, are from all over the country, from urban, rural, some other farmers, other organic farmers in Oregon, like myself. And it's an amazing group. We're all really engaged, really following this case very closely, and we all feel very invested in the outcome. So, let's see. So, this is 2 pages. So people ask me, how does some kid from a farm in Oregon end up suing the Trump administration? And, growing up on the farm, I felt definitely a close connection to the land, to nature, and so I was really conscious and conscientious of environmental issues. So as I started learning about climate change, I started getting involved in my community, speaking up against fossil fuel infrastructure, natural gas pipeline, and also really pushing to get solar panels installed at my high school. And so it was sort of through my community involvement that I got to know a law professor at the University of Oregon named Mary Wood. And she's really articulated in some of her work. She wrote a book titled Nature's Trust. And this is really a lot of the theoretical foundation and underpinning of our lawsuit. So through her, I got to know some of the plaintiffs in the other state level cases and the attorneys, and ended up asking to be a plaintiff on this federal case. So in August 2015, we filed our suit against the Obama administration, actually, in the Federal District Court of Oregon, and we're demanding a national science-based plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to really discuss the case in detail, and through sort of explaining the legal aspects, really get at the ethical, the moral underpinnings of it. Are there any lawyers in the room, by the way? Okay, just a few, good. All right, excellent. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to try to do justice to these ideas. Pardon the pun, I'm sorry. And the key aspects that I want to discuss are legal standing, the legal claims, the remedy that we're asking, what we're asking the government to do, and then the current status of the case. Where is it heading and what's going on with it right now with the Trump administration and everything that they're doing. So standing, for those of us non-lawyers, what that means is there has to be a personal and particular harm to you from somebody's actions, something someone is doing, in order to sue them. You can't just say, I don't like it, so I'm going to sue you. I wish you could. But so what in this case, what that means, the government's actions that allow and promote unsafe levels of CO2 emissions are causing harm to all of us in our lives. And so a few examples of those actions are leasing out federal lands for fossil fuel production, subsidizing fossil fuels, and everything that President Trump is now doing, rolling back the Clean Power Plan, rolling back fuel efficiency standards, and rolling back everything, even the somewhat, I would argue, minimal protections that we got under the Obama administration. All of these actions that the government is taking are contributing to these emissions, which are ultimately down the pipe causing these impacts to us in our lives. And so for me personally, some of those impacts, I actually wrote a 12-page document for the court enumerating all of the specific harms that are incurring to me and to my family's farm as a result of climate change. We had the 3 hottest years ever recorded in Roseburg, Oregon, the closest measuring station to the farm. The hottest was 2015, followed by 2014 and 2013. This does not pass the straight face test, that this is not resulting from climate change, that climate change is not significantly contributing to this. And so as a result of that, some of my family's hazelnut orchard died. We had Douglas fir trees that were killed by the drought and the heat wave. And there were tremendous fires in my home community. Tens of thousands of acres burned, and the plumes of smoke were immense. It was indescribably huge, and from 50, 100 miles away, you could see these just tremendous plumes of smoke. And so there's also damages. We live very close to the Pacific Ocean, and so I enjoy visiting these very beautiful, very fragile. If you ever get to visit the Oregon coast, I really recommend it. Tide pool ecosystems and coastal ecosystems. The cutting edge science, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, is now saying that we could see 5 to 10 feet of sea level rise in the next century. And so these ecosystems, I like to use the phrase, it's a narrow ecological band that will be wiped out in short order over the course of a couple decades if we don't turn around our actions and stop contributing to this immense sea level rise. And the rising ocean hits home for a number of my co-plaintiffs in a very personal way as well. My co-plaintiff Levi, who lives in Florida, his family's home sits very close to the sea, to the beach. And in just a couple of decades, if we don't turn around the course we're on, it will be inundated. There's not really an argument you can make to say that home won't be destroyed. So these are just a few of the very personal and very harmful impacts resulting to us from climate change, and especially some of my co-plaintiffs who are also farmers who are dealing with drought, with record-breaking heat and drought. These are really very severe impacts. My co-plaintiff Victoria Barrett goes to school here in New York City, and during Hurricane Sandy, she wasn't able to go to school, and the floodwaters damaged her school, and other things. So those are some of the harms personally that people in my generation are already beginning to feel as a result of climate change. So that's what gives us the ability to sue them over this. So what are the legal arguments? And these really lead into the ethical, philosophical underpinnings. Basically, the overall thrust is that the government's actions are unconstitutional. The actions that are causing climate change to become worse and to accelerate are violating our constitutional rights. And so within that, there are 3 main arguments. One is based on the 5th Amendment to the Constitution, one is based on the 9th Amendment, and the other is based on the public trust doctrine. And I'm going to just go one by one on these because they really illustrate the ethical paradigm that we're putting forward. So the 5th Amendment says, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So what does that mean? The government cannot just arbitrarily come and destroy your possessions or kill you. And so if you look at these climate change impacts on a grand scale, they are indeed destroying our property and killing people of my generation, and it'll get much, much worse over time. And Judge Aiken, in this beautiful ruling that I mentioned earlier, she talks about this and she affirms what we're saying. She says, where a complaint alleges governmental action is affirmatively and substantially damaging the climate system in a way that will cause human deaths, shorten human lifespans, result in widespread damage to property, threaten human food sources, and dramatically alter the planet's ecosystem, it states a claim for a due process violation. To hold otherwise, she writes, would be to say that the Constitution affords no protection against a government's knowing decision to poison the air its citizens breathe or the water its citizens drink. And so I think this puts it in really clear terms that if the government, even though the harms may be going through kind of a complex process through environmental damage, they're still very real, and it's just as real and concrete as if the government were poisoning the water or the air that we breathe, and leading to death of people. So, and there, so to get at some of sort of the philosophical, the theoretical underpinning of this, there's a political scientist at the University of Oregon named John Davidson, and he's really written about how fundamentally this theory draws from concepts of human rights. It draws from the idea of the social contract, and these theories that were articulated by some of the Enlightenment era thinkers, such as John Locke, notably, these foundational thinkers of our current system of government. And so what Locke really argues, and these are some of the texts that I'm studying actually at Columbia right now. All sophomores are required to take some of these philosophy classes, but what Locke really argues is that we enter into a social contract with each other, into an agreement when we form the government, and the purpose of it is to preserve those basic rights to life, liberty, and property. Because without a government, those rights would be exposed. People could steal your possessions. People could kill you with impunity. The purpose of a government is to protect those basic rights, those basic interests that we need for our survival. If a government actively destroys those rights, then it's worse than no government at all. So what this means really is that our case speaks to the fundamental purpose of government, which is to protect our survival, which is to protect these basic rights that it's currently infringing on. And Aiken affirms this, and this is an amazing thing to see, this explicit discussion of political theory, I think, in a court ruling, where she says, the social contract theory, which heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers, provides that people possess certain inalienable rights, and that governments were established by consent of the governed for the purpose of securing those rights. Accordingly, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution did not create the rights to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Documents are, instead, vehicles for protecting and promoting those already existing rights. So what this means is we have, these are natural rights that we have, that we need for survival, and the government cannot just trample on those rights as it's currently doing. So this really leads into the second argument, which is based on the Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, a right does not have to be explicitly written in the text of the Constitution for it to exist. And so what we are arguing is that the right to a stable climate system is really implied by the Constitution and by our system of government. The main reason for that is that other rights are based on the right to a stable climate system. Other rights rest on the foundation of the right to a stable climate system. And those include those rights like life, liberty, property, survival, and just our basic ability to exist on this planet. Without a stable climate, these rights cannot exist. And so in this way, the case is actually similar to the gay marriage case that went to the Supreme Court in 2015. Obergefell v. Hodges is the name of that case. And that's where they said that the right to marry the person that you love is not explicitly written in the Constitution, but other rights rest upon that foundation. The ability to come together and form a family is really essential part of our social fabric. And Judge Aiken, again, affirms this argument. She says, I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. Just as marriage is the foundation of a family, a stable climate system is quite literally the foundation of society, without which there would be neither civilization nor progress. So a key item that she's really acknowledging here, kind of implicitly, right, is that the impacts from climate change really fundamentally threaten our civilization and our ability to come together and form an organized society. When we talk about 5 to 10 feet of sea level rise, the untold tens and hundreds of millions of people who would be displaced by 5 to 10 feet of sea level rise, the international conflict, the war, the anarchy and chaos that would result from that fundamentally is a threat to ordered society. And that's what she's really recognizing here. This leads into the third argument, which is based on the public trust. And so what the public trust doctrine is, this is an idea, it's an ancient legal doctrine that goes back all the way to ancient Rome and Emperor Justinian. And it goes through the Magna Carta and ancient England, and the U.S. Supreme Court recognizes this concept. And so essentially what the concept is, the government has to preserve certain essential natural resources upon which society relies for its survival, and it has to pass those resources along to the next generation so that society can really continue to endure and survive over time. There are two things that the government cannot do. It can't sell the resource, and it can't allow the resource to be destroyed, essentially. And so a classic example of this is the rivers. So I think when I was a young kid, I was fishing with my father, and I asked, well, who owns the river? And obviously, what he told me was no one owns the river. And the reason for that is that rivers are a public trust. The government has to manage them as a trust. The government is a trustee responsible for taking care of the river. And the beneficiaries of that trust who benefit from fishing, swimming, etc. from the river are all of us, the citizens of the state, under the government. And so another classic example of this is the ocean. And this came up in our case where Judge Coffin, who's another one of the judges at the Oregon Federal Courthouse, he asked the federal attorneys and he asked the fossil fuel attorneys, so let's say the federal government wanted to sell a parcel of the ocean itself, just the whole thing, a piece of the ocean, to Exxon. And so Exxon could own the ocean, and they could drill in it, and they could, if someone wanted to swim in the ocean, they would have to pay a $50 fee. If they wanted to go surfing, they'd have to pay a $100 fee, perhaps. Would that be constitutional? And amazing. It was a really shocking thing. Both the government and the industry lawyers said, yes, that would be fine. So this, and you could see the look on the judge's face, and just about everybody there was thinking, are you serious? Are you seriously going to make that argument that the government could just sell the ocean? And so in the context of climate change, the first person who's really brought up this public trust idea is my friend, the legal scholar, Mary Wood. And so what she makes is a similar argument to some of these other arguments that I've been talking about, which is that the more classic things like the ocean and rivers and waterways that are recognized as a public trust, those depend on the stability of the atmosphere. They're inseparable. And we need to acknowledge what's a growing ecological understanding, that different aspects of the Earth system are all intertwined together. So if we allow for example, if we allow the climate system to heat up because of climate change, that causes the ice sheets to melt, which causes sea level rise. And so if the ocean, as one example, is a trust, if the government has a responsibility over the ocean as a trust, it can't allow ocean acidification and sea level rise that would damage the ocean and also cause tens of millions of people to be displaced from their homes. And Mary Wood, in her book, one of the most salient phrases that she says is that the trust encompasses a moral covenant that transcends all governments, cultures, and peoples on Earth. And this really gets at sort of the moral underpinnings of this idea. It's based in the idea of intergenerational equity, of the obligation, as we heard at the beginning. We don't We don't own the planet. We don't loan it out to our children. We borrow it from them, essentially. And so this, again, it's analogous to my family's farm. Each generation passes this farm along to the next and doesn't allow it to just become destroyed. So a really great example of how the government is violating its responsibilities here is it does what's called discounting. So what this means is when it's deciding what to do about climate change, it actually values the dollar value of future climate impacts less than current value. So essentially what it's saying is that the impact matters less, it's less valuable in the language of money if it happens to future generations than happens to us right now. This is wrong morally, and it's also a transgression of these fundamental responsibilities the government has to future generations. So really all three of these claims are guided by the principle that our essential rights, our basic rights that we need to survive, they all rest upon this foundation of stable climate system. government has to preserve the climate system and pass it along so that we can continue to survive and continue to enjoy all of our rights as citizens. So what are we asking? And Judge Aiken, in this ruling, she affirms all of these arguments. And so what are we asking? If we win the trial, what are we asking the government to do? Government will have to prepare and implement a science-based plan to begin reducing CO2 emissions at the national level. This plan, we are asking for it to be based on the work of, having a little bit of feedback here, I think. The plan is going to have to be based, we're asking, on the work of Dr. James Hansen, who is the Director of Climate Science at Columbia University. And he's put forward the 350 parts per million target, which you're probably familiar with from Bill McKibben, 350.org. This is what we need to do in order to stabilize the climate system so that climate change doesn't continue to get worse and there isn't a buildup of heat that destabilizes the climate. So what's the current status of this case? The good news is that the judges have been very clear. They want to see the trial. And the trial, by the way, for those of us like me who are not lawyers, the trial is going to address the facts, the factual assertions, rather than these purely legal aspects I've been talking about. The judges want to see the case go to trial this year. Trump administration cannot stand the idea of being put on trial for climate change. They hate it, and they're trying to slow it down as much as they can. They said, it's going to take us 5 years to do all of this, to look through all of these documents that we need to see. The great irony is you've got the U.S. Department of Justice and these world-class corporate law firms here on the one side are saying, oh, we just don't have the time, we don't have the resources to do this in the next year. And then on the other hand, you have this small grassroots group that's relying on student interns and even some undergraduates like me, and we're saying, yeah, we're ready, we can do this right away. So there's a great irony here, and it's quite transparent. This is just foot drag. This is just the government cannot stand the idea of being put on trial for climate change and having some actual responsibilities to citizens and to future generations. It's terrifying to them, which is delightful. So the Trump administration, and in the same vein, the Trump administration's policies really underline the importance and the urgency of this case. Approving the Keystone Pipeline, approving the Dakota Access Pipeline, rolling back the Clean Power Plan, rolling back auto fuel efficiency standards, and all of the other things that they're doing under Scott Pruitt, who seems to not know whether he believes in climate change or not. These really underline the importance for the courts to take action. And of course, Congress is just completely out to lunch, asleep at the wheel under Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. I don't know if they know whether they believe in climate change either. And those of us who remember from, third grade civics, we have 3 branches of government: the Congress, the president, and the courts. Only one of them, the courts, is left for young people to really, like me, to really turn to for a solution. A really key aspect. How am I doing for time, by the way? Oh, I'm already can I get, how much? A couple more minutes? Okay. Well, it's a really key thing that I want to emphasize is the idea of the point of no return, tipping points in the climate system. This is why we can't wait 4 more years for another president, is that we're really approaching the point of no return for climate change. Once you warm up the planet to a certain degree, the ice sheets, the melting of the ice sheets begins to sort of take on a life of its own. The Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets in the next couple of years, if we don't turn this thing around, we're going to really reach the point of no return, where we lock in unfathomable amount of sea level rise, more than the 5 or 10 feet, but just an amount I don't even want to think about. So this is why we can't wait for another Congress, another president. The courts have to take action now, and they are. They are beginning to. The trial is going to be in fall of 2017. The judges have made very clear. And this is going to address a number of things. One of it's going to address what the government has known and the decisions it's made. And one really interesting thing that I want to just touch on briefly, we're looking at a long history of the government's decisions. We're looking at their internal deliberations and also going to presidential libraries, all the way back to the mid-20th century. And in fact, you are the first audience to hear. I recently visited the John F. Kennedy Memorial Library up in Boston, and I found ironclad evidence that John F. Kennedy knew about climate change all the way back in the 60s. This really shows that Trump epitomizes, as terrible as he is, he doesn't exist in a vacuum, and he epitomizes 50 years of failed climate change policy. Really briefly, what can you do to help? I think the most fundamental thing is really lift up the youth voice in your own activism and advocacy. Really lift up the youth voice. My generation is crying out and asking for a solution to this problem. At an even more fundamental level, bring human rights and constitutional rights into the conversation. This can be a central, as I said at the outset, this can be a really central organizing principle. We have a right, an absolute, inviolable human right to a stable climate system that we need to survive, to go on living on this planet. And there's not much of an argument once you establish a right to something. There's not much anyone can really say. It's something that's unconditionally guaranteed to you. For those who are interested in more sort of getting involved, there are a couple attorneys, I guess. We could always use pro bono help on this. But for those who are more interested in specific ways to plug in, just talk to me afterward. And thank you so much again.